It's so much fun.
Okay, good morning and welcome to the second day of the conference. Before we start by introducing our keynote speaker today, let me remind you that at the end of the day, around 5 p.m., there will be the General Assembly where we ratify all the decisions and we make new elections as well. So for CIMA Association member, you have the right to participate and vote. Please join us. Okay, so it's a pleasure and an honor to have David Simchi-Levi with us. David is a professor of engineering systems at MIT and serves as the head of the MIT Data Science Lab. He's considered one of the premier thought leaders in supply chain management and business analytics. His research interests include statistical learning and decision-making, transportation and logistics systems, supply chain management, revenue and yield management, optimization-based decision support systems, operations research, flexibility and risk management, among others. David published more than 150 papers, most of which in top academic journals, and he served as editor-in-chief of Management Science for Operations Research and for Naval Research Logistics. He was elected a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and he has been awarded a number of prestigious prizes, including the Informs Impact Prize, the Informs Koopman Award, the Ford Motor Company 2015 Engineering Excellence Award, just to cite a few. He has also founded 3 companies, which later became part of big groups, including IBM, Accenture, and Accenture Applied Intelligence. And today, David is presenting a paper on supply chain resiliency and the need for stress tests. Thanks for joining us. The stage is yours. Please.
Good morning, everybody. Morning. I'm going to talk about a hot topic in industry, that of supply chain resiliency. But before I dive into the topic, I want to tell you a little bit about the environment at MIT that led to this research. At MIT, I lead the MIT Data Science Lab, which is a partnership between MIT and about 25 companies, focusing on some of the most important challenges that these companies have by bringing together models, data, and analysis. The partnership is cross-industry. As you can see, we have partners in oil and gas, retail, consumer packaged goods, manufacturing companies, financial service organization, government, the state of Massachusetts, insurance companies, airline, industrial equipment, software and consulting companies. And we have a global footprint. Let me illustrate some of the research that we do at the lab and give you an insight about the challenges and the impact of our work. One important area at the lab is the area of supply chain resiliency. Today, supply chain resiliency is a very hot topic in industry after what happened over the last 4 years with COVID, with weather disruption, with shortage of semiconductor chips, with the war in Ukraine, with the impact of the attack in the Red Sea. Companies, executives are looking at supply chain resiliency, trying to see what to do. We at the lab started looking at supply chain resiliency way before the pandemic. After events like the tsunami in Japan and the flood in Thailand, if you remember, of 2011, or the volcano eruption in Iceland of 2010, events that affected companies in multiple industries, from automotive to pharmaceutical to high tech. We develop a new way for companies to measure the resiliency of any supply chain, identify hidden risk, and develop mitigation strategies. We were fortunate enough to partner with the Ford Motor Company and implement our technology at Ford supply chain. We published a few technical papers, as well as a Harvard Business Review paper in 2014 that tried to describe the framework, the method, the implementation at Ford, and the impact on the Ford Motor Company. And that year, we received the Best Technology Award given by Ford for a technology that was implemented at the company that year. So at Ford, there was a lot of recognition to the technologies that we developed. I tried to generate a message to a lot of companies. I knocked on many doors, trying to convince companies that they should look at supply chain resiliency. Very little interest. Maybe 10 companies joined us, Boeing, United Technology, very few companies. Most supply chain executives were focusing on cutting costs in their supply chain, not on supply chain resiliency. In their mind, supply chain resiliency is just a cost activity. They were not interested. Everything changed at the beginning of the pandemic, but perhaps not in the way you expect. Think January 2020. The pandemic was in China. It was not in North America, and it was not in Europe. My wife and I just came back from a trip to China on January 8th, and I started collecting data on what's happening in China, and I realized that I can use the technologies that I developed 6 years earlier to understand the impact of what's happening in China on supply chain in North America and Europe. And I very quickly wrote and published a paper in Harvard Business Review, because the paper was for executives, saying in the title, but in particular in the first paragraph, that the peak of the impact, remember, this is written in January, that the peak of the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chain will happen in mid-March, forcing thousands of companies to reduce or shut down assembly and manufacturing facilities, both in the US and in Europe. And this is written by the end of January, about what will happen in mid-March. And this prediction, based on data and models and analysis, was highly accurate. Look at this. March 17, Fortune magazine reported that the European automotive industry is completely shutting down. The next day, March 18, the New York Times reported that the automotive industry in the US, in Canada, in Mexico, completely shutting down. And after that, there was a lot of interest in our technology. Literally, it has been implemented in hundreds of companies. 2 months after the publication of this paper, I published a follow-up where I said, companies need to apply stress tests to make sure they are ready for the next disruptions that will surely hit their business. And I highlighted the technology is here, the models are here, the KPI, the performance measures are here for companies to use. And I emphasize a few critical supply chain: healthcare, life science, food, and now we know semiconductor chip manufacturing company. I was excited to see that in the US President Economic Report, published in May of 2022, think about what I'm describing. He's the highest decision maker in this country. The US President Economic Report published in May of 2022, there is a section on the concept that came out of our lab recommending to companies to apply stress tests to make sure that they are ready for the next disruption. So this is certainly one important and active area of research in our lab, even more so today. A second area of research is dynamic pricing, or some people will call it price optimization. We at the lab do price optimization for brick and mortar retailer like Coppel. Coppel is a large retail chain in Mexico. We at the lab price their product every week for 500,000 SKUs in about 1,500 different stores. Think about what we are describing. We are not a consulting company, but we develop the engine that week over week, SKU by SKU, store by store, price their product. We also do it for online platform. People here from Europe may be familiar with Zalando. Zalando is the largest online fashion retailer in Europe. Our technologies that came from the data science lab, price 1.5 million SKUs every week in 23 countries where they sell their product, taking into account substitution and cannibalization, as well as global and SKU level business requirement. And now I'll take you to a topic that is very hot in industry today. We started using Transformer, which is the engine under generative AI, already in 2018, automating the entire process. If you think about Gen AI and Transformer, this is probably one of the first implementation of the technology to automate decision-making, in this case, to automate pricing decisions. As we did the work, we realized that an important challenge is how do you validate that the algorithm works? That is, we developed the algorithm, we tested the algorithm for pricing for different companies offline. And then the company said, for example, Zalando, okay, we need to go through a field experiment. How do you perform a field experiment? You do a traditional A/B testing. You take a cluster of product, you split it into control and treatment, and you give the old algorithm, the old pricing policy to the control, the new pricing policy for the treatment, and you compare the two. Very quickly, you realize that this is not going to work. Why? Because whatever you do in the control affects not only the control, but also the treatment. And whatever we do in treatment affects not only the treatment, but also the control. So in this paper, we focus on the optimal design, switchback experimentation. In switchback, instead of splitting products, we split time. For the first 2 weeks, for example, we will use only the control on all the product. And then we switch for 3 weeks to use only the treatment. And then we may switch back to the control and so forth and so on. How do you design optimally a switchback experiment is what we are doing here. These are analytics that we developed and implemented for a number of companies, now used by companies who never collaborated with us. P&G just reported to us that they are using the same algorithm. As we did the work on switchback experimentation, we realized that adaptive experimentation is very important. And let me illustrate the need for adaptive experimentation by giving a life science example. Think about COVID and think about the new drug, Paxlovid, that was developed by Pfizer. The way Pfizer tested the new drug, they take a large population of infected people, they split them into control and treatment, they give placebo to the control, the new drug to the treatment, and they compare the two, what they call a randomized control trial. Here's the problem. Very quickly, the manufacturer realized the new drug is quite effective. Yet, in randomized control trial, we don't change the experimentation. Still, 50% are receiving placebo, creating loss of life, loss of welfare. Question is, can we do better? In this paper, we focus on adaptive experimentation, where we start with a small batch. We split it into two, a small batch of infected people. We split it into two. We give half a placebo. The remaining group, we give the new drug. We observe the results. And then we start allocating a little bit more, because we are not sure, to the new drug, because the drug shows a sign of effectiveness. So, for example, in the next batch, 60 and 40. 60 goes to the new drug, and 40 goes to placebo, and so forth and so on. In this way, we prove that you can find the optimal balance between the accuracy of the experimentation, comparing the performance of the new drug to placebo, and minimizing regret, and in this case, minimizing loss of welfare. So that's a second line of research in the lab. A third line of research is personalized thing. By the way, the co-director of the lab who just stepped in is the one, if anybody's interested in price optimization, dynamic pricing, she's the one who led the work at Zalando, the online platform, and Coppel, the brick and mortar retailer. She's sitting there. If you are interested in the great insight about this analytics. The third area of research is personalized offering. Let me illustrate personalized offering with an example. We just came back from London yesterday. If you fly today from London to Paris, when you purchase your airline ticket, we are not involved. But once you purchase the airline ticket, our system, the MIT system, kicks in and offers you ancillary products. Priority boarding, car rental, hotels, and the like. And the offers that you will get may be different than the offers that I will get, because the system is learning online about individual preferences and adjusting the offers based on what you learn. As we implemented this online learning algorithm in multiple airlines initially and then in online insurance companies, we realized a very important challenge in statistical learning, in online learning. And the challenge is when you implement online learning algorithm, every time you move from one environment to another, you need to redesign the algorithm because the algorithm for online learning highly depends on the reward function. If the reward function is linear, one algorithm. If it's quadratic, another algorithm. If it's a third type, a third algorithm. This is not the case in offline learning. In offline learning, the assumption is that data is available before you make your decision. In offline learning, we have, and this is probably what all of you are teaching when you teach machine learning, we have very powerful algorithms that are independent of the reward function. This gives an insight. Is it possible to reduce online learning to offline learning, use whatever is available for offline to solve the online learning? When you talk to your colleague in computer science, the intuition is that the answer is negative. Why? Because in offline, the assumption is that the data is IID. But in online, the data is not, because my decision today depends on what I saw yesterday. Despite this, in this paper called Bypassing the Monster, we show that they are very positive. You can always reduce online learning to offline learning with whatever is available for offline to solve the online learning problem, despite the difference between the two. And that's the critical thing, whenever the offline learning is optimal in terms of mean square error, it minimizes the errors that the algorithm makes, the online is learning in terms of regret. So this reduction basically simplifies dramatically the need for effective algorithm for online learning. As we implemented these techniques in the airline industries, executives in the airline industry were impressed by the impact of our algorithm, but they were wondering how come we are ignoring all their offline data that they have, right? Because these airline carriers have a lot of data that they collected over a long period of time. As a result, in this paper, we identify, we characterize under what conditions offline data can help in the online learning and by how much. So that's the third area of research. The fourth area of research is mostly supply chain, but on the intersection between data science and supply chain, inventory, transportation, and procurement. If you know Blue Yonder is considered the largest software company in the supply chain space. For this company, we develop analytics for last mile delivery. The one that I want to tell you a little bit about here is Home Depot. We collaborated, so the last mile delivery algorithm is described in this oral paper. And the Home Depot is described in this POMS paper. Let me a little bit explain what we did for Home Depot. Home Depot decided to collaborate with us, but they had no idea what we can do. So they gave us transaction data from their e-commerce platform, data that spans about 5 years. Analyzing the data, we realize the speed matters. What do I mean by that? When a customer goes on Home Depot website and is looking at a specific product, if the website says you will receive the product in 24 hours, the purchase probability is much higher than if the website said you will receive it in 7 days. That suggests a beautiful opportunity. If I want to respond fast, therefore increase the purchase probability, therefore increase expected revenue, I need to position inventory very close to market demand. That will increase speed, as a result, increase expected revenue, but it increases inventory, and as a result, it increases supply chain costs. Alternatively, if I want to reduce inventory and supply chain costs, I want to position inventory upstream in the supply chain. Why? Because I can use pooling effect. I can aggregate across many locations. That reduces inventory, but increased time to market, as a result, reduces the purchase probability. In this paper, we show how we develop a stochastic optimization model that help Home Depot position inventory effectively, and it's the impact on its bottom line. The next area is all about resource allocation for IBM, Alibaba. We stopped working with Alibaba in 2018 when the tension increased between the US and China. And then with life science company, Boston Scientific. And finally, a little bit about supply chain digitization. For AB InBev, we developed a new way to understand market demand. And let me explain this by describing the challenge that the company had. Before the pandemic, AB InBev had a very effective forecast in different markets. And this effective forecast was developed by their data scientists, highly accurate. But as soon as the pandemic hit at the beginning of 2020, the forecast was destroyed. Because consumers changed their behavior, it affected demand, which affected forecast accuracy. In the work with AB InBev, we show how we take pandemic modeling, apply it to different regions, and use it to improve forecast accuracy by building the original forecast that the company had. And so we did not ignore the forecast that they had, we just took advantage of their forecast together with pandemic modeling. And finally, for a number of companies, we developed reinforcement learning algorithm for inventory optimization in their supply chain. Here, I am going to focus on supply chain resiliency, and I'm not going to get into the technical model, but I'll tell you a little bit about the technical model. I'll describe the key concept and the approach. And remember, this was developed in 2013, 2014, and the proof that it's working in a large scale came during the pandemic. So after the beginning of the pandemic, we literally had hundreds of companies using our technology. And I can summarize the insight from implementation in multiple companies in different industries with this slide. Excellence in supply chain resiliency requires three capabilities that come together with the technology that I will describe. The first one is proactive management. Proactive management is basically the planning side. I want to quantify the resiliency of my supply chain, identify hidden risk, and develop mitigation strategies. That's what you think about when you think supply chain resiliency. The second one is continuous monitoring. Nothing is wrong in my supply chain, but I want to continuously monitor how much exposure I have to supply chain risk. For many people here, this is not a surprise. This is much like financial companies monitor on a day-to-day basis their exposure to financial risk. We have the same idea in supply chain. And the last one is effective response. The idea is I'm going to use the same technology once there is a disruption to decide how to allocate my remaining resources to maximize certain objective. And when you do that, you realize a few things. First, resiliency for a lot of companies is competitive advantage, because if I can respond, and I'll show you at the end comments from a number of executive who reported on using the technology. Because if you respond faster than the competition, then you grab market share from your competitor. And I'll show you two examples to illustrate this. But in order to do that, companies need to balance efficiency, which is all cost, resiliency, and business performance. For this purpose, you need to build, we call it here a digital tool, just a model, but use new KPIs that are different than performance measures, that are different than traditional measures used in supply chain. They are time to recover, TTR, time to survive, TTS, and PI, which is performance impact. And when you do that, you will find that risk in supply chain is typically hidden in unexpected places. And I will illustrate this concept with the first implementation of remember, 2013, we started collaborating with the company. Initial focus was on North America assembly plants. The supply chain that support, you don't need to be a supply chain professional to understand this example. The supply chain that support for North America assembly facilities is global. They have suppliers in US, in North America, in Europe, in Asia. After the tsunami in Japan and the flood in Thailand, the leadership at Ford assembled a group of executives to identify where should they focus. Procurement had an answer. Procurement told Ford executives that they need to focus on strategic suppliers. Who are strategic suppliers? Strategic suppliers are suppliers where Ford spends a huge amount of money with every year. So these are the most important suppliers. We should focus on them. The leadership was not sure. They asked, think about their insight, 2012, can we use data and analytics to either validate this or identify risk in other places? We developed the technologies that I'm going to describe and integrated it with Ford supply chain. The initial implementation, the first time we did, including the development of the technology and the implementation, took 24 months. Now, this can be done in between 10 to 12 weeks. One of our partners, if you remember one of my slides, is Accenture. Accenture signed a big contract with MIT to scale our technology to all their clients. And so we know from literally many different implementations that now this can be done in a very short period of time. Okay, so what is this capability? Here is Ford North America assembly plant. They are here. The supply chain, as I mentioned, that support Ford North America assembly plants is global with suppliers in North America, Europe, and Asia. You can see here the blue facilities represent facilities that are owned by Ford. For example, the engine plant is a tier 1 facility, but it's owned by Ford. The transmission plant owned by Ford. You can also see that there are multiple tiers of supply. This is not just a simple single-tier supply chain. Just to get an insight about the scale, in tier 1, there are about 6,000 suppliers. Think about what I'm describing. 6,000 suppliers. Where should I focus? I can't do everything. And so identifying the suppliers to focus on is really a critical question. In this supply chain, there are about 60,000 different components that are used in the assembly of cars. And so in terms of complexity, in terms of scale, in terms of impact, it's an enormous supply chain. To understand our concept, let me take a simplified version of Ford supply chain. You can see here the assembly plants and multiple tiers of supply. Ford cannot do everything. The question is, should we focus on the engine plant? Should we focus, for example, on the chemical suppliers? For this purpose, let me introduce a few concepts. The first one is the concept of time to recover. We introduce a chemical supplier, and we try to understand through this interview how long it takes the chemical supplier to recover to full functionality after a disruption. This supplier is telling us that it will take 2 weeks. Why 2 weeks? Because now they provide us with chemicals from a facility that they have in China. If the facility is disrupted, they can switch production to another facility that the company has in Germany, and it takes about 2 weeks to switch production and ramp up capacity. You don't need to be deep in supply chain to understand that there are 2 challenges with this concept. The first challenge is time to recover is scenario dependent. And there is a limit to my ability to generate all the relevant scenarios, right? Think about 2019. How many executives were thinking about a disruption like the one that happened a year later, right? So it depends on scenarios, but there is a limit to our ability to generate all the relevant scenarios. And so you ask yourself, do you have anything that is scenario independent, right? So that's question number 1. Question number 2 about time to recover. If I call a supplier, this chemical supplier, and I try to find out from this chemical supplier what's their time to recover, the supplier is going to be optimistic. They know that if they told us it will take 6 months, it's a huge problem. So how do I validate information I collected from suppliers? Does this make sense? So these 2 challenges I need to address. Just let's hold on to this question. Suppose I validated the time to recover 2 weeks. Then I can use analytics to calculate performance impact. What is performance impact? I'm removing the chemical supplier for the duration of time to recover for 2 weeks. And I'm asking, when this chemical supplier is down, what is the impact on forward bottom line? And the impact on forward bottom line can be financial. For example, what is the impact on lost profit, lost revenue, lost market share? Or it can be operational. What is the impact on lost production in the assembly facilities? Because I build a digital twin that describes the entire supply chain, I can use mixed integer programs to identify this performance impact. And in this case, looking at revenue, the impact is, in this hypothetical example, is $400 million. Let me now show you screenshots from the system implemented by Ford. And here is the first one. What you see here are bubbles representing tier 1 suppliers. There are about 6,000 of them, right? On the Y coordinate, I'm showing you annual spend at each one of the suppliers. How much Ford spent, this is 2013, at each one of these suppliers. To protect Ford confidential information, I'm not showing you here the value itself, right? But this is the scale is exactly the scale based on the original values. So you can see that I have here a strategic supplier. Remember the definition by procurement of strategic suppliers. These are suppliers where Ford spend huge amount of money with. So here is one, here is the second one, here is the third one. And on the X coordinate, I am showing you performance impact measured by looking at lost profit. And these numbers straight from the system. You can see that strategic suppliers expose a company to some risk, but I would say just moderate. The riskiest suppliers are only the bottom right-hand side. I love this guy. I love this guy because this is a tiny supplier that nobody paid attention to, that provide Ford with components that cost 15 cents. But if supply is disrupted, enormous impact on bottom line. In fact, you can see if supply is disrupted, $350 million impact on bottom line for the company. That's why I say in supply chain, the risk is hidden in unexpected places. I'll show you another example in a second, but that's the first insight. The second insight is observed by looking at tier one suppliers by geography. You can see here all the tier one suppliers by geography. They are in North America, in Europe, and in Asia. Each bubble represents a supplier. The size of the bubble is proportional to the risk that each supplier exposed to. And you can see something important. Risky suppliers are everywhere. They are in Asia, they are in Europe, and they are in North America. This is counter to what you read in public media. What you read in public media is, hey, the problem is in Asia. If we just move suppliers and manufacturing activities close to market demand, we will guarantee resiliency of our supply chain. This is not consistent with the data, and it's not consistent with what happened during pandemic. Take another industry, take the food industry, in particular, take pork and meat supply chain in the US. The supply chain is completely domestic. But this industry, pork and meat, went through consolidation before the pandemic. As a result, during the beginning of the pandemic, when one of the processing facilities was closed because of the pandemic, enormous supply problems of pork and meat in the US. And so this is the second insight that I wanted to highlight. Remember, my first insight is that risk is hidden in unexpected places. This is an implementation in a large CPG company. I'm basically doing the same analysis that I did for Ford.
You measured the riskiness of 5 slide.
So remember, it's performance impact. So I create a disruption at this supplier, and I ask, what is the impact on Ford bottom line? And you notice, counter to what, for example, people in finance do, I don't take into account probabilities. I just, because that's why I'm emphasizing, I just focus on worst case analysis. You may ask why, and the reason I do that is because here, a lot of time we are dealing with very low probability, but high impact event. And so if we are looking at a specific event and you tell me, hey, David, probability is 1%, and I look and say, no, it's 0.5. This small difference is an enormous difference in terms. That's why rather than probability, I look at worst case analysis. So here is another example from a large CPG. This was done last year. You can see here for this consumer packaged good manufacturing company, you can see all the tier one suppliers. Here is the X coordinate is annual spend. The Y coordinate is impact on revenue. How much revenue will be affected when each one of the suppliers is disrupted. And I want to highlight just two examples. Here is one raw material, is stretch films that the company is using. Annual spend of this material is $12,000. But if this is disrupted, $50 million impact on revenue. This is this bubble. And here is another bubble on this raw material, which is glue. The CPG company spend $120,000 every year, but if supply is disrupted, $71 million impact on bottom line. That's why I say in supply chain, risk is hidden in unexpected places. Now, remember my question about time to recover. Time to recover depends, of course, on the scenario, depends on answer from the suppliers. I want something that is independent of scenario and independent of the answer from the suppliers. That's the concept of time to survive. Time to survive, those of you with optimization, is really the dual of time to recover. But I can explain it in a very intuitive way. What is time to survive? I remove a facility from the supply chain and I ask, how long can I meet supply with demand when this facility is down? It's not zero, because the pipeline is full with inventory, but I can calculate that measure. And you can see here on this slide, time to survive data from Ford supply chain. So what I have here on the Y coordinate, I'm showing you how many suppliers they have with that level of time to survive. And on the X, I'm showing you time to survive in weeks. You can see that Ford has suppliers whose time to survive is 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, all the way to 1 week. Then 8 days, 10 days, all the way to 2 weeks. Then they have suppliers with time to survive of 10 weeks, 20 weeks, 50 weeks, and I aggregated everything greater than 50 weeks into, they had suppliers whose time to survive is 60, 70, even 100 weeks. Just inspecting this slide, you can see a challenge and an opportunity for Ford. On the left-hand side, you can see immediately the challenge. These are all the suppliers whose time to survive is very short, 1 day, 2 days. These are the suppliers. I don't care what they are telling me. I know that I need to send business continuity teams to make sure the right mitigation strategies are there. The opportunity is on the right-hand side. Why on the right-hand side you have an opportunity? Because Ford not knowing much through inventory for their own product in their own location. That's why time to survive is very long. If I can reduce inventory by 30%, I can still have a very long time to survive, but I cut my supply chain cost significantly. That's why I highlight in Insight 3 that those facilities with short time to survive will lead to immediate performance impact when there is a disruption, while those suppliers with long time to survive provide saving opportunities. To summarize this concept, I highlighted time to recover, I highlighted time to survive, but the key insight is the relationship between the two. If time to recover is greater than time to survive for a specific facility, remember, this is facility dependent, then we will see a disruption. Alternatively, if I want my supply chain to be resilient, I want to make sure that every facility has time to recover smaller than time to survive. Now, what I describe here, and this will be my last concept that I'm going to talk about, what I describe here does not address a very important question, which is, I have a disruption in my supply chain. Now the disruption is over. How long it takes the company to go back to normal operation, right? And let me describe this with an example from the automotive industry. This is the largest automotive supplier in the automotive industry in North America. We model the supply chain all the way to the wafer manufacturing facility. So think about this, starting with semiconductor manufacturing, all the way to testing, assembly, manufacturing of their components, and all the way to the OEM, which are Ford, Nissan, GM, and the like. And the company, like any company, in order to guarantee service, for every component, they have a target inventory, right? They want to make sure that inventory level is always equal to or greater than the target inventory, because that will allow them to provide the service level that they committed to the OEM, to the automotive manufacturing company. So let's look at one of the components. This figure represents the data on one of the components. On the X coordinate, I'm showing you time before disruption and after disruption. And on the Y coordinate, I'm showing you inventory level for the component. I created a 10-day disruption in one of the wafer manufacturing facilities that the company is using. Company is using 4 wafer semiconductor manufacturing facilities. So I created a 10-day disruption in one of them. And you notice before this disruption, Inventory satisfies the requirement. Inventory is greater than the target inventory level. No problem. But look at this, even after the disruption was over, right? It's only 10 days in the wafer manufacturing facility. They cannot catch up. Look at this, inventory is going down. This is 300 days after the disruption, inventory is still down. How is it possible, you ask yourself, that I created a 10-day disruption, but we cannot close the gap, even 300 days after that? And the reason for that is because this supply chain in semiconductor was working during the time we did the analysis at high utilization, very high utilization. So once you have a disruption, executives have two objectives. The first objective, don't lose sale. So try to make sure every unit is sold if they can. The other, bring inventory back to the target inventory level. Clearly, the first objective is higher priority than the second. They don't have enough resources. They cannot achieve the second objective. And that's the concept of time to recover supply chain. It is the time it takes the supply chain to return to normal operation after the disruption is over. In this case, it took about a year to return. 10 days, a year to return. That's why I say, depending on the supply chain, short disruption may require a long recovery time. So let me skip this and just summarize and then take questions. It's important in supply chain resiliency to invest in data and analytics, and understand financial impact. Risk is hidden in unexpected places, so just using intuition and gut feeling is not going to be enough. We need to use new performance measures like time to recover, time to survive, performance impact, and time to recover supply chain. And I will close by highlighting 4 comments. This is Ford Executive VP for Product Development. He said, if you can do that analysis across your supply chain, you can learn how to prioritize and manage risk. Annette Clayton, who until recently was the CEO and president of Schneider Electric North America, gave a talk in September of 2021. Up to the beginning of the pandemic, they did not collaborate with us on supply chain resiliency. Right after the publication of the paper that I told you, Annette Clayton called me, said, we want to implement. And they very quickly did the implementation internally. And then a year and a half later, in September of 2021, she gave a keynote in an executive meeting in Chicago, and she said, leverage digitization, you can automate these capabilities, use concepts like time to survive and time to recover. And then she said, it will help you keep your business and growth healthy and keep your customers and shareholders happy. This is Danzo, the automotive supplier that I mentioned. They said the technology developed by the MIT Data Science Lab help us improve our supply chain. And finally, I love this chief procurement officer from the CPG company. Remember the company where I showed you one slide? She said, just very simply, this is a game changer for our company. Thank you. Comments, questions, reflections? Yes.
Very interesting. Have you talked about applying this to commodity markets, raw materials? And can it be applied? There are similarities and differences with the supply chain.
Yeah. So I'm not an expert on commodity market. It will be interesting to see if this is applicable. I'm not 100%. I don't want to invent answer on the fly. The only thing we did in our lab on commodity market is developing engine for pricing of commodities, but that's standard that I'm sure many have done. I'm not sure about resiliency.
What would you need to find out?
I would remember I look end to end, because at the end, it's all about the entire supply chain. I would love to understand a little bit what the supply chain commodity market looks like. What are we talking about in terms of the sources? How many, where they are, what are the lead time? Does this make sense? So understanding the supply chain here will be important. Yes.
About simultaneous default of supply or contagion across suppliers?
Say it again, please.
Simultaneous breakdown of suppliers or contagion across suppliers?
Yeah, perfect. So this is taken into account in our model. And we saw this problem. Let me just go to the supply chain. Okay. So you may say, and we saw it during the pandemic, certain policies were implemented in a specific region. If you have multiple suppliers in that region, all of them are affected. So it's not one. So the same concept applies. I block multiple suppliers, and I try to understand the impact of this disruption on multiple suppliers. The examples that I remember from the automotive industry, multiple suppliers in Italy, all of them were down because of the shutting down of activities in that region, and you want to understand what it is. So it's not just about simplifying everything by showing you one supplier at a time, but now you may say correctly, this introduces a combinatorics. We are not doing the combinatorics. We are doing it mostly by region. But if you want to insist on saying you need to look at any permutation, then just it's beyond our ability. Yes.
The relationship between the number of days of disruption and the number of days that you take to recover. You were just showing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I was curious because, like you mentioned, in Italy, that's after during COVID, then for this semiconductor company, if you wanted to go and buy a car, they were saying 2 years. So that was just. So what is the?
This is a great question, and this was the motivation for the slide that I showed. Let me just go. It's what you described. Here I'm showing you something very simplistic. When we did it with real data from a specific company, it took 1.5 years to come back, and that's exactly.
Because the disruption was much longer.
It's not because the disruption is longer, it's because the utilization of this supply chain was so high that you don't have capacity to catch up. When Jerome orders, they try to satisfy his order. When David orders, try to satisfy my order. There is not enough capacity to increase inventory and therefore service level. That's why they were saying what they did. And that was really amazing because everybody was saying, look, the wafer manufacturers are disrupted for a short period of time. How come these cars are sitting at the lot without key components, waiting for these key components? It's because of this. Okay.
The cases we consider here are hard disruptions where basically the supply stops and shut down for one reason or another, right? Now, but sometimes there are some green zones where they don't completely shut down. I was thinking about, for example, the gas market in Europe in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
In those cases, actually, the supply does not stop and ends up for a certain period of time. but then the supply reliability decreases to a certain level.
Yes.
And I'm going to start with this, and in a, you know, extension of the new vendor model, we found that there is actually a threshold below which actually your optimal supply, the optimal ordering goes to zero.
Yeah.
But above which actually you reduce your ordering.
Yeah.
And this is still a disruption.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So are those operational based methods to deal with operational resilience applicable to this case as well?
So what we need to deal with the scenarios that you described, and that question comes up every time. They say, look, in all your explanation, when you talk about disruption, it's complete shutdown. But a lot of time it's not. It's just the capacity is reduced by 30%. That's easy to incorporate, right? You take the same facility, the capacity is 100 per week before, now it's 60 or now it's 70. So there is a way. It's not addressing everything that you describe, but there is a way to do it because of concepts allow you to have scenarios where you shut down not completely, but partially. Yes, in the back.
You assess
Yeah. So that's a very important point. So when I have the chemical supplier and I say time to recover of 2 weeks, it may be that it's because there is an alternative supplier. And I know that I will call the chemical supplier and say, I don't have capacity, I can switch to the alternative supplier, and the alternative supplier can respond in 2 weeks. That's it taking into account into the model. So substitution is very important. Dual sourcing is very important. That's why determining time to recover is so important. Yes.
What is your reading of company Boeing and all these very low probability events which took place? Were they deeply correlated, or what happened there?
Yeah. I don't know. I have no idea exactly what I have a student, Yao Zhao, who wrote a paper on what's happening in Boeing, but that's his research. If you are interested in the topic, you can look at the work that he has done on the company. Yes.
Perhaps related to the question of substitution. So how far do you go in your recommendation to firms in terms of what to do with what you find?
Yeah.
Namely, should you replace a supplier? You should redesign a product to make it more.
Great. It's a slide that I skipped. So let me go to the slide that I skipped, if you don't mind. So remember, I went quickly through this slide. So here is the slide. So the question is, how do you design mitigation strategies? Basically, that's your question. This is the same slide that I showed when I highlighted hidden risk. Every dot here is a tier 1 supplier. This is annual spend. This is performance impact. So let's start with the easy stuff. On the left-hand side, you have all the tier 1 suppliers whose impact is very low. This is no more than tracking inventory, contracting, and so forth and so on. Not a big problem. At the top right-hand side, you can see strategic suppliers, right? Here also, it's relatively straightforward. Ford spend huge amount of money with each one of the suppliers. As a result, they're in good position to say, hey, you need to provide us with another facility in a different region in the case of disruption, right? No, not a big surprise. The challenge is here. Why the challenge is here? Remember, these are tiny suppliers. This is a supplier that provide Ford with stuff that costs 15 cents. If you tell the supplier, hey, I need you to have another facility in a different region, you bankrupt the supplier. So that's not a good solution. You may say, it's not a problem, just build inventory. But inventory is against the lean philosophy that these companies have. So there is a lot of pushback against inventory. You may say, okay, not a problem, just dual sourcing, right? What the previous question focused on. Here is the problem here with dual sourcing. These are low-cost components. Competition here is on two dimensions. First, it's on quality. Everybody's competing on high quality, and everybody is competing on low cost. As a result, there are only very few suppliers that can survive. If one is disrupted, the entire market is disrupted. So dual sourcing is not helping us. What we found here, we need to think out of the box. And let me give you two examples. You highlighted one. Here, one example is new product design. Why new product design? How come new product design can help? Because what Ford found, they can standardize this component. If they can standardize this component, they can go to the supplier and say, hey, we are going to give you huge volume because now your component goes through all our cars. But in response, in recognition of what we are doing, you need to build another facility in a different region. So that's one out of the box, what you were highlighting. A second one out of the box we found in high-tech. The high-tech partner for this type of component basically acquired this supplier. They didn't acquire the supplier for core technology. They acquired the supplier for supply chain needs. Now, acquiring the supplier is not going to solve the problem. But once they acquire the supplier, they build another facility in a different region. Does this make sense? So here, I find it's the most challenging part of the business. The last thing that I will say about this, think about the following question. How many procurement officers go to sleep and think, oh, this tiny supplier is my problem in my supply chain? Not at Ford, not at the CPG. Typically, nobody is focusing on these suppliers where I spend $12,000 a year. Think about this. Here, $12,000 a year. This guy, right? But if disrupted, $50 million impact on bottom line. Not at the CPG, not at Ford, not at all the implementations that I've been involved in. That's why doing the analysis with data and analytics and quantifying exactly what are the strategies I need to implement is an important part of supply chain activities. Okay. Thank you.